Hello, thanks for joining us. This is Lesson 9 of Basics of Biblical Archaeology. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for watching. I hope you caught the last lesson on Hazor, which was Lesson 8. If you didn't, we'll start off by kind of reacquainting you to the site. So let's look at the map and the mound quickly to reorient ourselves to the site of Hazor. Hazor is located here in the Jordan Rift Valley. That's this, going from south to north, this Rift Valley, with the Sea of Galilee here, and Hazor is located right there, close by. So Hazor would have been in a very arid, hot climate in antiquity. It's obviously in the north. It's one of the northernmost points in the land of Israel. In fact, when one of the excavational teams was working here at Hazor, they had to stop their excavations due to an attack, literally rockets that are fired from Lebanon. So the excavators all had to take off from the site, leave, and it was ended for the summer because of the conflict. So it's very far in the north, not far at all from Lebanon. This photo then gives us a little bit of a glimpse of what the whole site was like, which, remember, consists of two halves. The upper city, which was the Tell, the smaller part, and the larger part, the lower city, where a huge number of Amorites and possibly Canaanites lived in antiquity. So here is the upper city. You can see the work, some of the excavation that was done on the top. You can see how it slopes down into the valley around it here. And then the lower city is this entire portion here, which shows you it was the most enormous city in all of Canaan, and not even a close second. It was a great, great site, which is why the Bible even refers to it as the head of all those kingdoms in the earlier time, the time before the conquest under Joshua. So now we begin our study of the strata, or the occupational levels at Hazor that followed the conquest. So what was the occupational phase right immediately after the conquest? That is Late Bronze Age 2A, and in the upper city, it's known as stratum 14 in Roman numerals. And then the lower city was also reoccupied at the time, and that's known as stratum 1B. So it's 1B or 14, one or the other, that connect us to Late Bronze Age 2A at Hazor. The dates for this are roughly 1370 BC to 1300 BC. So let's take a look at what we find at the site during Late Bronze 2A. So here are some of the features at Hazor for the Late Bronze Age 2A. Stratum 1B, that's in the lower city, represents the peak of Hazor's prosperity in the Late Bronze Age 2. In Area C, a small broad house temple was discovered in the inner slope of the rampart. Also in Area C, several nearby houses, including potters' workshops, served the temple. The local and imported Mycenaean 3A pottery date the city to the El Amarna age. And that's roughly 1396 to 1346 BC. We know the Amarna age as the time in Egypt when Akhenaten ruled. And Akhenaten was a monotheistic king. In other words, he believed in the worship and the existence of one God. So he discarded with all of the other gods of Egypt, and he just focused his attention on the Aten. And it's during the Amarna period when we read about, in these letters called the Amarna letters, conflicts that happened in Canaan. And they're mainly conflicts that happen between petty kings or petty rulers in Canaan, or between petty rulers in Canaan and attackers, those who would or did bring great harm to them. And the most troublesome of all, by far, are the Apiru. In a future publication, I will be attempting to prove that the Apiru are the equivalent not only of the Habiru, but of the Hebrews. It's all one people. And this reflects the work that's required in Canaan for the later Israelites after the lifetime of Joshua to rid the land of the Canaanite peoples and kill off their lines and free up the cities so that the Israelites could live in them. That's the Amarna age. Tomb 8144 contained hundreds of vessels, including Mycenaean three-ware, and the tomb was in use for the entire stratum, that is, that first occupational phase after the conquest of Joshua. But one find strongly suggests that the tomb also was used just prior to Joshua's conquest. That is, the tomb used before and after the hiatus of the 30 years. So in other words, there was a 30-year period of non-occupation at the site, from roughly 1400 to 1370 BC, and only in about 1370 is it re-inhabited, and then we see signs of culture blossoming at the site again, and it turns into this great city all over again, from scratch this time. But this tomb that's a part of the site records mostly burials from that very time period after, beginning in 1370 in late Bronze Age 2A, but it also contains a little bit of material from the previous occupational phase, and that's going to get our attention. So here's a look at Tomb 8144, where these important finds were made, and you can see lots of full, complete pots here as a result of the lack of this tomb having been broken into in antiquity or any time in modern times. So the archaeologists found it with the remains just as it was after the final burials of the tomb. Tomb 8144 not only revealed amazing pottery finds, but something else of great significance. In here, they also found an extremely important scarab from the reign of Thutmose IV. Thutmose IV is an important pharaoh for a number of reasons, and we'll get to that in a moment. First, here's a look at a little bit of the beautiful Mycenaean pottery ware that was discovered at the site. And this is imported ware from the Aegean. Beautiful pots, in most cases, painted on the sides with very careful work, excellent craftsmanship. So these are beautiful and cherished vessels. Here now is that scarab I was telling you about. This scarab is from the reign of Thutmose IV. And you can see there's an inscribed cartouche here that's not that discernible or visible to the untrained eye, but we'll look at the drawing of it in the next slide, and that will make it clearer. So this scarab was found in Tomb 8144. So let's focus a minute on this scarab from the reign of Thutmose IV. What was that king like? Well, this stratified royal scarab of Thutmose IV cannot be considered a later reproduction or a mere family heirloom that someone passed down from generation to generation. As Yadin explained, all Thutmose IV scarabs are rare and a boon to archaeologists in this country, because we know that they were made exclusively during his reign. The names of some pharaohs continued to be inscribed on pharaohs after their death, but the popularity of Thutmose IV was buried along with him. We can therefore conclude that the cave was first used sometime during his 8-year reign or immediately afterward. So this tomb was used almost certainly at its beginning in the reign of Thutmose IV. Well, when did he rule? His regnal years were 1418 to 1408. And of course, the destruction of the city of Hazor takes place in 1400 BC. So this fits perfectly with biblical history, that a pharaoh whose scarabs would not be reproduced in later generations because he was loathed so much and despised, but this reflects a scarab that clearly would have been produced during his reign. So someone who was alive during the reign of Thutmose IV had the scarab and was buried with it in Tomb 8144. And remember, 1400 is when the destruction of Hazor takes place, at the end of the conquest under Joshua. So this is 8 years earlier, so it barely makes it within that window that there's time for this pharaoh to be on the throne. before the destruction 8 years later at the end of his reign. There are more things that we know about Late Bronze Age 2A. For example, in areas C and H of the lower city, some buildings were adorned with orthostats that they robbed from earlier levels, such as Late Bronze Age 1, and of course that's the time of Joshua's destruction. In Area H, the temple was constructed during the El Amarna age, but its plan is essentially different than that of the two earlier structures, or strata, although it partly was built on their foundations. So this is really important. If you remember, we had those two temples in Area H, one from the final Middle Bronze era and one from Late Bronze 1 era. And they matched almost perfectly, uniformly, suggesting that we have very strong cultural continuity between the occupations, which suggests that a lot of those same people or their relatives re-inhabited the site or continued to inhabit the site after whatever problem they experienced at the end of the Middle Bronze Age and beginning of the Late Bronze Age. But the transition from Late Bronze Age 1, the time of Joshua's destruction, into Late Bronze Age 2 is a very different transition because the temple plans are very different, suggesting to us we probably had a completely different cultural group move into the city and take over and rebuild it. That would make sense if there was a total annihilation of the population by Joshua and the Israelites. Only on the northern side was the later temple influenced by the plan of the earlier ones. The temple comprised three main elements built in succession from north to south, with the doorways on a single axis leading into each chamber: the portico, antecella, and cella. The cella, or Holy of Holies, featured a rectangular niche in its northern wall. Well, remember we talked about lion orthostats that were found and used in the Late Bronze Age 2A, this new occupational phase after the destruction under the Israelites? Well, here we have one of those orthostats, and it is used secondarily. In other words, it was originally crafted or sculpted in a previous period, almost certainly Late Bronze Age 1, and then after the destruction of the city, it was dug up or whatever, and then reused somewhere else on the site. And again, this kind of robbery corroborates the story of a complete destruction and things falling into disrepair and disuse. So anything that was discarded and hadn't been covered up by time or dirt or anything would be fair game in the rebuilding process, including this lion orthostat. Now let's take a quick look at the temple architecture that I said is very different in the transition from Late Bronze Age 1 to Late Bronze Age 2. So the Temple of Stratum 1B in Area H is a completely new building, built on the ruins of the Late Bronze 1 temple. For the most part, the plan follows that of previous temples, with the addition of an entrance hall for the portico. The niche in the temple's cella is 3.75 meters in width and 2.1 meters in depth. In its right and left corners were two post holes, which served as sockets for wooden poles, undoubtedly having been used to screen the niche. Now let's look more carefully at that temple that experienced this change in its architectural design with this new occupational phase at Hazor after the destruction under the Israelites. So here is the new temple, the temple of Late Bronze 2A, and here is the previous temple before Joshua arrived, of Late Bronze Age 1. So what are the differences? Well, this new temple has no mechanism here to guard or protect the niche, so that's gone. That's a difference. 2, there's an added pillar in the center of the room. This could be used as a pillar. This hole could be used for a pillar, or it could be used as a hearth. It's difficult to say without seeing the actual material. So that's another difference between the two temples, is this new hole in the middle that hadn't been there before. 3, these chambers of the antecella are different in number. There are 3 here, 1, 2, and 3, which there were only 2 before, and they have a different design than in the previous structure. So that's another difference between the temples. Then fourth, we've added here a closed-in portico. So almost certainly, because of the fact that we now have 2 pillars, 2 twin pillars, like we read about of the Temple of Solomon, that the portico had 2 twin pillars, Joachim and Boaz. Well, here we have such 2 twin pillars that hold up a structure above, which undoubtedly is a roof. So there's a roofed portico that's added to the temple in this phase. So you have a very different design in pretty much every one of the rooms or portions of the temple. You have something structurally very different than it was in the earlier phase. So that suggests that we have a completely different cultural group in this new occupational phase at Hazor. Now, here's a quick look at the cella, or the Holy of Holies of this temple in Area H. You can see the 2 column bases here for columns to be erected. You see a divider here in the middle, the niche in this area here, and you can see that the protecting piece is gone from the previous stratum, probably a bench here. So this is the most important room in the temple, the place where the deity itself dwelled, and that would have been right in this area here. Most likely there would have been something it was propped up on, perhaps made of wood, which is why we don't see anything structurally here, but almost certainly it was raised off of the ground. So this is where the deity dwelled, and the priests came and served it in the temple. Well, there's more that we know about this occupational phase. For example, occupants of stratum 1B reused the gate of stratum 2 with several modifications and the addition of a cobblestone floor of the type found in areas A, H, and M, which was during Ben Tor's excavations since the 1990s. The section of the wall adjacent to the gate was rebuilt, but the casemate wall of the 2 previous strata, built in Middle Bronze 2C and reused in Late Bronze 1, was replaced by a brick wall that was 3 meters thick. The city of this stratum was destroyed, but the circumstances of the destruction, at least at this point, are still pretty much unclear. Yadin suggested that perhaps Seti I campaigning in the Levant included the destruction of Hazor. So that's just a speculation that maybe the Egyptian king came along, Seti I, and the first king of the 19th dynasty, and he sacked the city of Hazor. That's possible, but we don't really know. Certainly it's possible that the Israelites were the culprits. If this were the case, we don't really know about it from the Bible, but there's no doubt that lots of cities were overtaken by the Israelites, and it never shows up with the ink that's recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Now we turn our attention to the last Canaanite phase of occupation at Hazor. This is Late Bronze 2B. You can see that in the upper city, it's known as stratum 13, and you can see that in the lower city, it's known as stratum 1A. And the dates for this are, and it's rough for sure, it's roughly 1300 BC to about 1217, or a little bit later BC, but probably not earlier, according to biblical chronology at least. So stratum 1A in the lower city is a reconstruction of stratum 1B, with structures that are essentially the same as those of its predecessor. And of course, that already should be suggesting something to you. It should be suggesting to you that this is probably the same cultural group that persists at the site from the end of Late Bronze Age 2A into the new phase, Late Bronze Age 2B. Due to their position being so close to the modern surface of the ground, the structures were poorly preserved. So the problem is, this was the last occupational phase in the lower city. And since no other occupation was built on it, nobody came by to level it. And to level it, of course, you're adding a bunch of earth, a bunch of soil, and gravel and whatever else, and that helps preserve what was there beforehand. But when it's not purposefully done and done soon after the events for a new occupational phase, then it's subject to the elements and to weathering and wear and tear. So that really provides reason for this. The temple of Area C also was reconstructed, and all of the accessories of the former stratum were found in situ, which means in their original setting as left by the ancient people, such as a row of small basaltic stellae and a statuette of a seated male figure. The figure's head was broken off deliberately, and of course that suggests to us that it was an intentional desecration, which the average ancient person didn't do. You can mess with people all you want, but you don't play with messing with their gods. That's too dangerous. This matches the decapitation of basaltic statues of gods and kings that were found among the remains after the destruction of the final Canaanite city, as well as the smashing of ritualistic vessels found in the temples. This desiccatory destruction was argued by both Yadin and Ben-Tor as attributed to the Israelites. So the final Canaanite city's destruction is connected by the excavators to the Israelites. I agree completely, but I disagree with their suggestion that it was Joshua who's responsible for this destruction. In Area F, most of the buildings surrounding the altar were renovated. Many incense burners and Mycenaean 3B vessels were found in this stratum, which was destroyed completely by the invaders, who almost certainly can be identified as the Israelites under Deborah and Barak. Contra under Joshua, as Yadin and Ben-Tor have suggested. For support, you can see my 2008 journal article, which was published, a peer-reviewed journal article, in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society. There, I argue vehemently that the Late Bronze Age 1 destruction is Joshua's, and the Late Bronze Age 2B destruction, this one, is under Deborah and Barak. Two very separate destructions. Clearly, the Bible implies that they were at very different times and different overtakings with different Israelite leaders. So there's no question there have to be two destructions of the city of Hazor. So consult my article if you'd like more on this. In Area H, the temple is identical with the previous one, with only minor repairs and alterations. So there we go. We're back to the Area H temple. It's almost completely identical to the previous one. The floor of the Holy of Holies was raised, and two new column bases were found resting on it, one of them still being the lower part of a stone column. The hall was widened at the expense of a side room on the eastern side. Two round column bases were found in situ, as per Joachim and Boaz with the Solomonic temple. The cultic furnishings were found in a thick layer of ash, especially in the Holy of Holies, showing that a conflagration is responsible for the destruction of the temple. So somebody wanted to sack the temple and destroy anything in it possible, to desecrate it, to show that this was something being taken out, waged against the God that supposedly or allegedly resided in the temple building. The new temple of Stratum 1A is virtually the same building as that of Stratum 1B. The few changes include the following. The floors were raised, two new pillars were set into the floor of the cella, and a partition wall was erected. The temple was destroyed and set ablaze, preserving a unique assembly of cultic vessels and furniture, virtually all of which were left in their original positions. This destruction was Israelite, with full religious desecration. Here is an image of the final temple of the Canaanite period down in Area H in the lower city. The columned portico, remember the columns that are introduced at the beginning of the Late Bronze II period, so the previous stratum, the first stratum after Joshua, that's where these are added, pillars here, and this entire enclosed portico is added as well. And again, showing that we almost certainly have a roof over top of it originally. The Holy of Holies is here, and the antecella is here on two sides. And this is the pathway, of course, leading into the temple. And you see the niche at the top of the screen here, and that's where the deity would have resided. Then here's a look at the cultic vessels that were found in situ. You can see several of them here. These are all spiritual. These would be for libations or for offerings that were made. But this is an incense burner, and it has a symbol on it, this right here, and that symbol tells us that it's the storm god. Who is the storm god? Well, the storm god, by this time, has become one of the, if not the most important already, deities in Canaan and the entire Levant. The storm deity is essentially considered to be the king of the gods. So it's the king of the gods who is revered as the greatest in the Levant, and he's the one around whose worship, pretty much the majority of the religious activity is involved in the Levant. In many cities, he becomes the patron deity. He's the chief god of that city. And certainly, temples are built to him in virtually all of the important cities. We know of the storm god by a number of names. The name Hadad is one, Teshub is another, and one that you know of from the Bible is Baal. That is the southern Levantine name for the storm god who becomes the king of the gods. And of course, this is the god with which the Israelites become infatuated. They fall in love with Baal, and they give up Yahweh, or He who is, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for the worship of Baal. That's how bad it is. And constantly the prophets of Israel are rebuking the people because of their worship of this storm god, the king of the gods, Baal. The end of this phase, the final Canaanite occupation at Hazor, is highlighted by the destruction of the city by Deborah and Barak. We see it in Judges 4:24. If you want to read about it, that's the chapter to go to. In Area A, in the upper city, later Israelite builders leveled the area, in the process destroying and sometimes completely removing remains of the strata below. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us, that the Israelites wouldn't want this material to be found by their children and played with as toys and whatnot. It was, in many cases, just completely removed from the area to kind of start from scratch as much as they could. Excavations in Area M, led by Ben Tor near the turn of the 21st century, have produced a superb temple. The intentionally cracked podium and damaged implements are clear signs of a campaign designed to dismantle and desecrate Hazor's cultic institution. This type of destruction is very rare in the ancient Near East, as most conquerors exercised far more restraint for fear of offending some god or gods of the people they were conquering. But the Israelites had no problems at all destroying and desecrating the religious paraphernalia of the inhabitants, the pagan people who lived there before they did. Now let's look at some of the images of what things looked like in Area M at this final Canaanite destruction. First, and this is a view down inside a temple. And you can see, first of all, that everything here is made of black stone. How do you get black stone? Well, Hazor is located, remember, very close to the Sea of Galilee. And if you know what happened in greater antiquity, the Sea of Galilee is resting on a dormant volcano. All around it is volcanic rock. One of those forms of volcanic rock is basalt, usually black, and this is such black basalt that can be mined and used and hewn and applied to the building projects such as this temple to make it very beautiful and to make it very unique. So this temple has a staircase here. The lower part of the temple is below that staircase. And this basaltic piece right here in the corner is a podium on which almost certainly a chair was placed and the deity would have been propped on top of it. This gives you kind of a worm's eye view of that same temple. We see the stones on which you would walk. So these are floor stones, essentially, made of basaltic rock. Really beautiful. And here is the raised podium. And you can see how pristine it is, or was, before it was cracked. And that would be intentionally cracked by the destroyers of the temple. But it was very finely hewn stone and very carefully measured and placed in its position here in the temple. And then we have layers above here that represent future occupation. And so this would have been a floor level for Israelites who occupied the site right here. And then other Israelite occupational levels are above. Remember I was mentioning that the podium that's here in this temple probably had a god on it? Well, what makes us certain of this is here we have, and there's one that's in the shadows you can't really see, but there's one, and there's one, and there's one. 4, not completely holes dug down, but they're to some extent post holes. They go down just a little ways, and they're essentially sitting there in position so that something can be dropped within them. And what would be dropped within them would be the legs of a chair, 4 legs of a chair, just like we have today. So this chair, or piece of furniture at least, would have sat on top of the podium, made of wood or whatever, and then the deity probably would rest on top of it. So this was in the right room, in the Holy of Holies, and it was at the right place at the back of the room of the cella, and that is where the deity would have sat propped up. And you can see the cracks that are littered throughout the top of this beautiful, strong, thick basaltic podium. That suggests to us that the destroyers had some kind of vengeance that they were wanting to take out on it. And sure enough, it seems like they did. Not only were the structures of the temple damaged, but the items used in the worship cult also were damaged, such as these tools here for cultic libations. They were probably taken by the Israelites and just smashed down against the podium or something else in the temple to smash these bowls, these libation bowls. And you can see they're very strong, they're very sturdy, and they're very thick. So it would take some force to break these. They wouldn't just break on their own. This is an intentional destruction. Then we have another view here of this same area, and that's in area M, where the temple stood here and the stairway existed. And so here you can now see the difference in the occupational phases. So these pillars represent a much later Iron Age occupation, and this was Israelite for sure. So this would be the floor level here of the Israelite occupation phase. And the pillars would represent some kind of building and its structure. Then, in more recent times, the archaeologists at Hazor found in Area a number of large storage jars that were filled with grain, just like we saw in Jericho. You remember the jars, the thick, heavy jars full of grain that Kenyon and Garstang had excavated before her? Those jars were full of grain, and that was at the destruction of the city. Here, we have such storage jars that were found. And there is one of the lead excavators, Shlomit, who is bending next to some of these storage jars, and you can see how large they are and that they were filled with grain. And then the conservators were able to reconstruct a number of these large storage jars to allow us to see what they originally would have looked like. And sure enough, they're just gorgeous, and they could have stored an enormous amount of grain, which suggests to us that the city was once again destroyed during harvest, probably, or sometime shortly after, where they were storing or keeping the remaining amounts or portions of grain that hadn't been consumed yet. So this is a great picture of what life was like at Hazor right before the destruction under Deborah and Barak. All evidence for the destruction by Israelites at God's behest, with God's help, to be able to turn the country over to them more fully and to turn the cities over to them that they could finally occupy, because they hadn't occupied them after they came into the land. They continued to live as semi-nomadic people. But soon after, things would change. Thank you for joining me for Lesson 9, our second half focus on the site of Hazor. From here, we're going to look at other sites and see some of the important things that demonstrate that biblical history and biblical chronology is trustworthy.